The night felt heavier than it should have, the kind of weight that settled not on the shoulders, but somewhere deeper, behind the ribs, where instinct lived. Dean Martin understood that feeling well. It had followed him from smoky club stages to glittering studios, from the early days when his Italian surname was whispered with suspicion to the polished evenings when applause came easily but respect still had to be earned. This was not his first time sensing that a room was about to turn, but it was the first time in a long while that the tension came not from critics or contracts, but from something older, uglier, and far less predictable. Part one of this story had ended with a quiet victory. Dean had stepped in when a young singer, barely known and already dismissed, was publicly mocked by a powerful promoter who believed humiliation was a tool. Dean had said very little that night. He had only placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and told the band to play again, slower this time, as if dignity itself needed room to breathe. The audience had followed Dean's lead, and the laughter had died where it stood. The promoter had backed away, surprised not by anger, but by calm resistance. It should have ended there. But men who build power on fear rarely forget being made small. The venue this time was larger, grander, wrapped in velvet and cigarette smoke, the kind of place where chandeliers glowed like captured suns, and the front tables were reserved for men whose money spoke before they did. Dean was the headliner, announced in gold letters, his name carrying the promise of ease and charm, of laughter that felt like relief after a long day. Backstage, everything appeared normal. Musicians tuned their instruments. Stagehands moved with practiced efficiency. Yet Dean noticed the glances that lingered too long, the way conversations lowered when he passed. It was not superstition that made him pause before stepping into the light. It was experience. The injustice revealed itself slowly, the way real cruelty often does. During the first set, Dean sang as he always did, his voice smooth, unhurried, as if time itself bent politely around him. The audience responded warmly, but one table remained still. At its center sat a man whose reputation did not need introduction, though no one dared say his name aloud. He was known as a fixer, a collector, a man who made problems disappear for those who could afford him. His presence was tolerated, even courted, by those who believed survival meant accommodation. What made the air tighten was not that he was there, but that he had chosen to make himself known. Between songs, as polite applause faded, the man stood. He did not shout at first. He smiled, thin and deliberate, and raised a glass toward the stage. His voice carried easily, trained by years of being obeyed. He spoke of loyalty, of gratitude, of remembering who helped you when you were nothing. Then his words sharpened. He reminded the room, casually, that some people owed their careers to protection, to favors granted in dark hallways, to silence bought and paid for. It was not a speech meant for the audience. It was a message, and it landed squarely on Dean. The humiliation was subtle but unmistakable. It played on old prejudices, on the idea that an Italian-American singer could not have risen without unsavory help. It suggested ownership, as if talent were a debt to be collected. The crowd shifted, unsure whether to laugh, clap, or look away. Musicians froze, hands hovering above keys and strings. The injustice was not only toward Dean, but toward everyone who had ever been told their success was not their own, that dignity could be bargained for. The man ended his speech with a threat disguised as humor, a reminder that stages were fragile places and reputations even more so. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. Dean stood at the microphone, the light warm on his face, revealing nothing of the calculations unfolding behind his eyes. Anger would have been easy, defiance even easier. But Dean had learned long ago that power feeds on reaction. He let the silence stretch, long enough for the room to become aware of its own breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, almost conversational, as if addressing an old friend. He thanked the man for attending. He thanked him for his concern. Then, with a gentleness that felt almost tender, Dean told a story. He spoke of his father, cutting hair for men who paid little and demanded much. He spoke of nights when a song was the only thing that kept hope alive. He spoke of favors offered and refused, of doors opened by persistence rather than fear. He did not name the man or the accusation. He did not deny anything directly. Instead, he said that the only debt he recognized was to the audience, to the music, and to himself. His words were few, chosen with care, each one landing without force yet impossible to deflect. Then came the decisive action. Dean turned to the band and asked for a specific song, one rarely requested, slow and aching, about a man who walks away from everything that tries to own him. As he sang, he did not look at the threatening table. He looked outward, inviting the audience into the space of quiet resolve. The lyrics, simple and honest, reframed the entire moment. What had been a threat became a confession of weakness. What had been meant to dominate was rendered irrelevant. The effect was immediate and devastating in its restraint. Whispers rippled through the room, not of fear but of recognition. People saw, perhaps for the first time, that the threat had no power unless acknowledged. The man at the table shifted, his smile faltering as attention moved away from him. By the time the song ended, applause rose not as noise but as affirmation, steady and sustained. Some stood. Others wiped at their eyes, surprised by the release they felt. The fixer did not speak again. He sat through the remainder of the set in silence, his glass untouched. When the show ended, he left before the lights came up, escorted not by enforcers, but by the weight of his own irrelevance. No confrontation followed. No retaliation came. Word spread quietly, as such things do, that Dean Martin was not a man to be claimed, not because he fought, but because he refused to play the game at all. Backstage, the young singer from before waited, eyes wide with gratitude and something like awe. Dean smiled at him, the same easy warmth as always, and told him to remember the lesson. Dignity, he said, does not shout. It does not threaten. It simply stands, and in doing so, asks the world to decide who it will be. Years later, those who were there would struggle to explain why the moment felt so important. Nothing dramatic had happened. No blows were struck. Yet something had shifted. In a room built on fear and spectacle, one man had chosen calm truth over noise, and in that choice restored a sense of justice that lingered long after the music faded. It was not genius in the loud sense. It was genius in the way light enters a dark room quietly and changes everything. The kind that drifts back uninvited when a man is standing alone in a quiet room long after the music has stopped. Dean Martin sat in his dressing room that night, jacket still on, tie loosened just enough to breathe, listening to the distant sounds of the venue emptying itself of people and pretense. The confrontation on stage had ended without raised voices or broken glass, yet he knew better than to believe it was finished. Men who lived by intimidation rarely accepted being undone by grace. They waited, they planned, and they remembered. What the audience did not see was what followed in the days after. Phone calls that went unanswered, bookings that hesitated without explanation, a familiar chill moving through rooms that once felt welcoming. It was subtle, carefully designed to be deniable, the kind of pressure applied by people who believed power worked best when no fingerprints were left behind. Dean noticed it all, not with fear, but with the same steady awareness he brought to a song's tempo or a joke's timing. He had lived too long, seen too much, to confuse silence with safety. The deeper injustice revealed itself through others. A pianist he trusted was suddenly dropped from a show without cause. A stagehand was warned that working certain nights might be bad for his future. Whispers spread that Dean was becoming difficult, ungrateful, unwilling to remember who supposedly helped him along the way. The lie was old, dressed up in new language, and it strung not because it threatened his career, but because it tried to rewrite his life into something small and indebted. Dean understood then that this was no longer about him alone. It was about whether fear would be allowed to pass itself off as authority. The turning point began quietly, almost invisibly. Dean accepted an invitation to perform at a charity gala, an event meant to honor artists who had used their influence for good. It was public, well attended, and impossible to manipulate without witnesses. He knew the same man would be there. He knew the trap being set. And still he went. Not out of defiance, but out of principle. Justice, he believed, only mattered if it showed up when invited. The night of the gala carried a different energy. There was elegance, yes, but also tension, as if the room itself sensed an unresolved argument. When Dean took the stage, he did not begin with humor. He spoke first, calmly, thanking the organizers, the musicians, the workers whose names never appeared on posters. Then, without naming anyone, he spoke about dignity, about how art survived not because of power, but because of courage, about how fear could buy silence, but never respect. The man watched from his table, expression unreadable, waiting for provocation. It never came. Instead, Dean told a short story about a singer who once believed he owed his soul to men who claimed ownership of success. He described how that singer learned, too late, that nothing owned by fear ever lasted. The room grew still. The message was clear, but it was not an accusation. It was an invitation to reflect. Then Dean did something unexpected. He invited the musicians who had been quietly threatened, sidelined, or dismissed to join him on stage. No announcement, no explanation, just a simple gesture, open and unafraid. One by one they came, the pianist, the young singer, the stagehand who now stood blinking under the lights. The audience understood immediately. Applause rose, not loud at first, but growing, driven by something deeper than entertainment. It was recognition. It was relief. The man did not stand this time. He did not speak. His power, built on isolation and silence, had been undone in full view of everyone who mattered. There was nothing to threaten now without exposing himself. By choosing inclusion over confrontation, Dean had removed the ground beneath intimidation. The injustice collapsed not with noise, but with clarity. When the night ended, there were no headlines about scandal. There were no rumors worth repeating, but something fundamental had changed. People walked out lighter. Musicians spoke more freely. Invitations returned, not because of fear, but because respect had reasserted itself. Dean left quietly, as he always did, nodding to those he passed, carrying nothing with him except the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful response was simply to stand where others expected you to bow. Part 2 closes not with triumph, but with resolve. Dean knew there would always be men who mistook control for strength, but he also knew that as long as he chose dignity over dominance, the music would outlast them all. The quiet weeks that followed the gala, when victory did not announce itself and justice did not feel secure, only fragile, like glass left too close to the edge of a table. Dean Martin understood that silence after resistance was never empty. It was a pause, and pauses could be dangerous. He returned to his routine with deliberate calm, rehearsing in the afternoons, meeting producers in rooms that smelled of old cigars and polished wood, smiling when expected, listening more than he spoke. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, every instinct told him the reckoning was not finished. The man who had tried to claim him did not disappear. Instead, he adapted. Invitations arrived that were almost generous, offers wrapped in courtesy and nostalgia, reminders of shared backgrounds and unspoken alliances. There were dinners suggested in private rooms, conversations proposed without witnesses. The pressure shifted from threat to seduction, a quieter form of control that relied on ego rather than fear. Dean declined each invitation with grace, never offering excuses, never showing irritation. His refusals were polite enough to be undeniable. That, too, was a kind of defiance. The injustice deepened when others began to pay the price. A club owner who had applauded at the gala found his liquor deliveries delayed. A radio host who praised Dean's performance suddenly lost sponsors. The message was clear and cruel. Support him, and you would suffer. It was a strategy designed to isolate, to turn admiration into liability. Dean felt the weight of it more sharply than any personal insult. He had endured whispers all his life. What he could not accept was watching decency punished for daring to stand. The suspense tightened around a single upcoming event, a nationally broadcast television special meant to celebrate the spirit of American entertainment. It was prestigious, untouchable, watched by millions. Dean had been asked to co-host, a role that placed him not just on stage, but at the moral center of the evening. Word reached him, quietly but unmistakably, that the same man intended to be present, not in the audience this time, but behind the scenes, leaning on producers, reminding them how fragile even respected platforms could be. The threat was no longer personal. It was systemic. On the night of the broadcast, the studio buzzed with controlled energy. Lights flared. Cameras rolled. Laughter cues were rehearsed. Dean stood just off stage, hands folded, breathing slow, aware that whatever happened next would echo far beyond the room. When he stepped into the light, applause met him like a wave, genuine and warm. He acknowledged it with a nod, his expression easy, almost serene. No one watching from home could have guessed how carefully the moment had been measured. The turning point came not from confrontation, but from timing. Midway through the program, Dean was given space to speak freely, a customary pause meant for humor or sentiment. Instead, he spoke about gratitude. He thanked the technicians, the writers, the musicians, the unseen hands that made the show possible. Then he spoke about fear, about how it often disguised itself as tradition, as influence, as protection. He did not accuse, he did not name. He simply described the cost of letting intimidation decide who was allowed to stand in the light. Then, with a simplicity that cut deeper than anger ever could, Dean invited the audience, both in the studio and at home, to applaud not him, but those who had quietly chosen integrity over comfort. The applause rose, uncertain at first, then stronger. As names were read, ordinary people made visible by nothing more than respect. Somewhere off camera, the man who had orchestrated so much pressure understood too late that his power had been exposed to a scale it could not survive. The aftermath was not dramatic, but it was decisive. Sponsors stood firm. Producers refused private interference. Those who had been targeted found themselves supported openly, their careers steadied by collective resolve. The man withdrew, not in defeat, but in irrelevance, his influence shrinking where transparency had entered. No one celebrated his fall. It simply happened, the way shadows retreat when light becomes unavoidable. Dean alone again, this time in his home, the television turned off, the night quiet. He poured himself a drink and sat without ceremony, reflecting not on what he had won, but on what had been protected. Dignity, he knew, was not something you defended once. It was something you chose again and again, especially when the cost was high. And as the city settled into sleep, Dean Martin remained exactly what he had always been, composed, moral, quietly powerful, and unowned by fear. The kind that arrives slowly and tests whether resolve was real or merely situational. Dean Martin felt it in the weeks after the broadcast, not as pressure this time, but as expectation. People watched him differently now. There was respect, yes, but also something heavier, a silent question hanging in the air. If fear no longer ruled quietly, then what would replace it? Courage, once revealed, demanded continuity. Dean understood that the hardest part of standing up was not the moment itself, but what came after, when others waited to see if you would keep standing. The injustice returned wearing a new face. It was no longer overt intimidation or whispered threats. Instead, it arrived as revision. Articles appeared that softened the fixer's reputation, painting him as misunderstood, as a necessary evil of a rough era. Conversations shifted toward balance, toward the dangerous idea that both sides had merit. It was a familiar tactic, one Dean recognized instantly. When wrongdoing could no longer dominate, it tried to dissolve into ambiguity. Truth, blurred long enough, could be made to disappear. This was perhaps the most insidious cruelty of all, not harm done loudly, but harm denied politely. Suspense tightened when Dean was approached privately by a powerful network executive, a man who spoke carefully and smiled often. He praised Dean's composure, his influence, his grace under pressure. Then came the request, delivered gently, almost apologetically. Dean was asked to keep future remarks lighter, less moral, less instructive. Audiences, the executive said, wanted escape, not reminders of uncomfortable realities. The implication was clear. Justice was welcome as long as it did not disrupt comfort. Dignity was acceptable as long as it stayed quiet. Dean listened without interruption. He did not argue. He did not remind the man of ratings or applause or public sentiment. Instead, he asked a single question, spoken softly, without accusation. Who decides what is uncomfortable? He asked, the audience or the people afraid of losing control. The room went still. The executive shifted, suddenly aware that he was not speaking to a performer seeking approval, but to a man who understood the cost of silence far too well. The turning point of Part 4 did not happen on a stage, but in a choice. Dean declined a lucrative opportunity that would have guaranteed safety and praise, choosing instead a smaller platform, a live appearance at a benefit honoring workers who had been blacklisted for refusing to cooperate with corruption. It was a risk. Cameras would be present, but not the protective glow of a major network. There would be no script strong enough to hide behind, only intention. The night of the benefit carried a raw honesty that no studio could manufacture. The room was modest, the crowd attentive, not glamorous. When Dean took the microphone, there was no grand introduction. He spoke plainly about fear's favorite weapon being confusion, about how wrongdoing survived best when good people agreed to look away for the sake of peace. He spoke of responsibility, not as burden, but as inheritance, something passed forward whether acknowledged or not. What followed was not applause at first, but silence, the kind that signals recognition. People saw themselves reflected, not as victims, but as participants in shaping what came next. When applause finally came, it was not thunderous. It was steady, grounded, sincere. Later, footage of the event spread quietly, shared not by networks, but by people. Its reach surprised those who believed control still flowed in only one direction. The fixer's influence fractured further, not because he was attacked, but because he was no longer needed. Once people saw that power could be resisted without chaos, his mythology collapsed. Fear had lost its exclusivity. Others could now do what he once monopolized. And so, without spectacle, the injustice that had thrived on shadows began to starve. Dean walking alone through a dim parking lot, coat pulled tight, the night cool and honest. There was no sense of victory, only clarity. He had not set out to change the system. He had only refused to let it change him. And in doing so, he had given others permission to do the same. The suspense that remained was not whether fear would return, but whether courage would continue to answer it. Dean, for his part, already knew his choice. The understanding that fear, when it can no longer dominate openly, learns to wait. Dean Martin felt that waiting in the air of Hollywood, in the polite smiles that arrived a moment too late, in the invitations that came with careful wording and hidden conditions. The fixer's power had weakened, but it had not vanished. It had dispersed, like smoke slipping into walls, settling into systems that preferred comfort over truth. Dean knew this phase was the most dangerous, because it tempted good people to believe the storm had passed when it had merely changed shape. The injustice surfaced again through erasure. Contracts were rewritten without names. Credits disappeared. Artists who had stood quietly beside Dean found themselves praised publicly while being sidelined privately. No threats were spoken, no demands made. It was punishment by omission, cruelty disguised as professionalism. Dean recognized it instantly, not as coincidence, but as retaliation refined enough to survive scrutiny. What unsettled him was not the strategy itself, but how easily it was accepted by those who told themselves it was just business. Suspense gathered around an upcoming tribute show meant to honor the legacy of American music. Dean's participation was expected. His absence would be noticed. Behind closed doors, he was offered reassurance, assurances that everything would be smooth if he agreed to keep things celebratory, nostalgic, uncomplicated. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Be charming. Be harmless. Let history stay quiet. Dean listened, nodded, and said he would think about it. In the days that followed, he visited people most never saw. Musicians whose careers had stalled after refusing to bend. Writers whose names had been removed from their own work. Stage workers who had learned to keep their heads down. He did not promise anything. He did not speak of plans. He simply listened. And in listening, he felt the full weight of what silence had cost others. This was no longer about a single man's pride or reputation. It was about whether truth, deserved a place in rooms built to forget it. The turning point came the night of the tribute. The theatre was full, cameras positioned to capture every smile, every nostalgic note. When Dean stepped on stage, applause rose instinctively. He waited, letting it settle, then spoke with warmth, thanking the audience for their love of music, for memory, for shared joy. It was exactly what everyone expected. Then he paused, just long enough for the room to lean in. Dean spoke about legacy, not the polished kind framed by awards, but the quieter kind written in choices. He reminded the audience that music had always belonged first to those brave enough to tell the truth, even when it made rooms uncomfortable. Then, without accusation, without bitterness, he invited several individuals to join him on stage, people whose contributions had shaped the very songs being celebrated, but whose names had faded from programs and plaques. The invitation was calm, unquestionable, delivered with the authority of someone who knew he could not be interrupted. The effect was electric. Producers hesitated. Cameras adjusted. The room shifted from ceremony to reckoning. One by one, the forgotten stood beside Dean, visible again, undeniable. Applause erupted, not rehearsed this time, but urgent, emotional. Some cried openly. Others looked away, confronted with the cost of their earlier silence. The fixer's influence, scattered and hidden, had no answer for visibility this complete. Afterward, there were consequences. Schedules were rearranged, calls were made, explanations offered. But the damage to injustice was already done. Once erased voices were heard, they could not be unheard. The system, exposed gently but firmly, began to correct itself not out of shame, but necessity. The world had changed, and pretending otherwise no longer worked. In a quiet moment, Dean sitting alone at home, the noise of the evening far behind him. He understood now that justice did not arrive as a single triumph. It came in layers, in persistence, in the willingness to keep choosing truth even when the cost shifted and the applause faded. There was still one chapter left, one final choice to make, and Dean knew it would ask everything he had learned about dignity, courage, and restraint. A moment when most stories would already have ended, when applause had faded, when reputations appeared settled, and when history seemed ready to file everything away as resolved. Dean Martin understood better than anyone that this was precisely when the final test arrived. Injustice rarely announced its last move. It waited until fatigue set in, until vigilance softened, until courage felt like something already spent. What remained now was not an enemy with a face, but a system bruised enough to retaliate quietly, one last time. The tension returned in the form of an offer that felt like closure, a prestigious lifetime honor, carefully framed as reconciliation, complete with glowing speeches and assurances that the past was behind everyone. The language was gentle, almost tender, but Dean heard what was not being said. The invitation came with conditions that were never written down but clearly understood. No more reminders, no more names reclaimed, no more uncomfortable truths spoken aloud. This would be the final image, the polished ending, the story wrapped neatly for public consumption. Many around him encouraged acceptance. They spoke of peace, of legacy, of resting after a long fight. They told him he had already done enough. Dean listened, as he always did, with patience and respect. But inside, something held firm. He thought of the faces on stage that night, the silence that had broken like glass, the relief of being seen. He knew that accepting the honor as offered would not erase injustice. It would simply place a beautiful frame around it. The suspense built not in public, but in Dean's private deliberation. Nights passed with him sitting alone, lights low, music playing softly in the background, weighing a single question. Was dignity something you preserved by compromise, or something you preserved by refusal? The answer, when it came, was quiet and absolute. On the night of the ceremony, the theatre was full, cameras ready, speeches prepared. Dean arrived on time, impeccably dressed, calm as ever. The audience rose to greet him, unaware that the story they expected was about to change. When he reached the stage, he accepted the microphone with the same ease he always had, waiting until the applause settled, until every eye was on him. He thanked them, sincerely. He spoke of gratitude, of the years, of the people who had walked beside him. Then, gently, without drama, he declined the honor, not angrily, not defiantly, simply and clearly. He said that recognition meant little if it asked him to forget those who were still waiting to be remembered. He said that celebration without conscience felt incomplete, and he said that he hoped the room would understand that this was not rejection, but fidelity to something deeper. The silence that followed was profound, not shocked, not confused, but heavy with understanding. Some faces fell, others softened. A few hands began to clap, uncertain at first, then stronger, until the sound filled the space with something that felt like truth settling into place. Dean handed the microphone back, nodded once, and walked off the stage without waiting for permission. There was no retaliation after that, no quiet punishment, no final maneuver. The system, confronted at last with a choice it could not soften or reinterpret, adjusted. Not instantly, not perfectly, but meaningfully. Policies shifted. Names returned. Conversations changed tone. Dignity became less negotiable. Dean did not stay to watch it happen. He returned to his life, his music, his calm routines, content not with victory, but with alignment. But with Dean sitting at home, the radio playing softly, a glass untouched beside him, he had never sought to be a symbol. He had only chosen again and again not to surrender himself to fear, comfort, or control. And in doing so, he left behind something more enduring than fame. He left a standard, a reminder that true power does not threaten, does not shout, does not demand. It simply stands, composed and unmovable, and invites the world to rise to it. The final moments are not about Dean Martin anymore. They are about the world he left quieter and stronger by refusing to bend. Years later, people would struggle to explain why his name carried a different weight than others from the same era. Not louder, not flashier, simply steadier. Younger performers would mention him not for a single song or joke, but for the way he made rooms safer without ever raising his voice. Studio workers would tell stories of a man who greeted everyone the same way, whether they owned the building or swept it. Musicians would remember how silence fell differently when he spoke, as if the room understood it was being asked to listen, not react. No headlines ever captured what truly happened that night. History prefers spectacle, but those who were there knew. They remembered the pause, the refusal, the dignity that did not negotiate. They remembered how fear lost its hold not because it was fought, but because it was ignored by something stronger. Dean never explained himself afterward. He never corrected the record. He never turned morality into a performance. He returned to his music, his laughter, his private life, carrying no bitterness. That was perhaps the most unsettling thing for those who believed power required domination. He proved quietly that integrity did not need witnesses to exist. And when the stage lights finally dimmed for the last time, there was no sense of unfinished business, only the understanding that some men do not change history by force or fame, but by choosing, again and again, to remain unowned. The curtain does not fall with applause. It falls with silence. And in that silence, dignity stands,